Chapter 9, Democracy in America. In 1819, only 32 years after ratifying her Constitution, the issue of slavery threatened to bring an end to the American experiment. Missouri applied for admission into the Union and became the first state forced to align itself with the Free State North or the Free State South. Slavery was well established in Missouri, but Congressman James Talmadge from New York tried to make it a condition of admittance that Missouri stop the further introduction of slaves and provide for the gradual emancipation of those slaves already living there. Since the founding of the Republic, new states typically came into the Union in pairs. At 11 free states and 11 slave states, this Missouri crisis now threatened to tip the balance of power toward the southern states. If it came in as a slave state, we would have 12 slave and 11 free. And you can see how political power in D.C. would thus advantage the slave states. The admission of Maine as a free state along with Missouri, a slave state, created the Missouri Compromise. Which ended the crisis, but only for a time. In the late 1820s, partisan divisions were emerging across the nation once again. A three-way election between Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, the son of the former John Adams, former president, and Henry Clay, sent the son of the first President Adams to the White House in 1824 in what Jackson called the corrupt bargain. By 1828, a new two-party system had begun to coalesce. Adams supporters called themselves the National Republicans. That's Adams supporters. Supporting the economic nationalism of the preceding years, loosely aligned with the former Federalists. Jackson's faction called themselves the Democratic Republicans, and they stood opposed to the economic aristocracy and the stratification of wealth and opportunity. They opposed the old federalism. They were the heirs to the anti-federalist legacy. The politics were of little matter as the election quickly became personal. Adams called Jackson a murderer and distributed a coffin handbill, very famous document, which listed the names of the American deserters that Jackson had executed legally in his Florida military campaigns against the Creek Indians. He killed soldiers who were trying to desert. His critics called his wife a bigamist, and when she learned of the accusation, she collapsed and later died. Jackson's wife had assumed her first husband had divorced her by the time she'd married Jackson, but he had not. She was married to two men at once, inadvertently. Jackson's electoral victory in 1828, after that corrupt bargain, which had sent the election of the president to the House of Representatives, and they'd thrown it to Adams instead of Jackson, who was arguably the more popular candidate. His victory in 1828 was less ideological than it was sectional. Regardless, his supporters of the South and the Western United States championed a new era of democracy and joyously swarmed the White House upon his swearing in. There's a famous painting of them essentially trashing the White House, coming in with muddy boots and just celebrating Jackson's victory. He was, many believed, the representative of democracy for the common man. America was a nation at a crossroads with the election of Andrew Jackson, former general. The National Republicans, represented by John Quincy Adams, feared that rapid growth of the country with new states would produce social chaos. And they argued that American authority needed to be centralized by political elites to contain this growing country. Jackson's faction, the Democratic Republicans, the Democrats, argued that the greatest danger facing the nation instead was the growth of inequality and privilege, and they came to power in 1839. Jackson is the founder of the Democratic Party that exists today. Thousands of Americans greeted Jackson at his inauguration, trashing the White House, leading one Supreme Court justice to lament the rise of King Mob. Too much democracy. Politics now became open to virtually all of the nation's male white citizens, and Jacksonians hailed the era of the common man. The franchise, the right to vote, began to expand after Jackson's election. As new states entered the Union, the requirement that men be property owners or taxpayer was gradually lifted state by state, even in the old states, and relatively peacefully. Only with an event called Dorr's Rebellion, which doesn't get too much mention in the historical record, and that was in Rhode Island. Only there did the fight open up The fight to open elections actually incite conflict, and that ended up with a new state constitution that expanded suffrage. Simultaneously, however, states across the North gradually disenfranchised their free black populations as they were enfranchising more and more white people. Even wealthy free black war veterans of the Revolutionary War, like James Forten, he had been voting his entire life. Citizens like him were deemed white enough to be taxed, but no longer deemed white enough to vote. The democratization of the country, of course, was far from complete. In much of the South, no slaves could vote. Even as free blacks in the North had trouble casting votes, no women could vote in any state. Nowhere was the ballot secret, as it was often spoken aloud, which meant people could be more easily bribed and intimidated into voting a certain way. Though factional competition in politics had been a very real part of the American political system since its inception, it was not until the 1820s and 1830s that most Americans began to think and accept that political parties might be a desirable part of our political process. In New York, political parties became institutionalized on the theory that permanent opposition between the parties would force politicians to remain sensitive to the will of the people as it shifted. Parties could provide checks and balances to each other in much the same way as the different branches of government. So what the founders had believed generally was that great men of value and valor could rise and represent the general will of the people. If this is the political spectrum, you've got some folks on the fringes, that we shouldn't have political parties that sort of one voice, like one great man, with the executive, for instance, could sort of speak for the people, or one great man could represent a certain district of a certain state and speak through the voice and speak as the voice of the body politic there. What Jackson began to believe, and many Americans of that era began to believe, is that perhaps the great man, especially after the corrupt bargain, maybe didn't actually speak for the people. They spoke for a fringe. Maybe they pretended to speak for the people, but they really spoke for an elite fringe. And so Jackson said, well, if they're going to represent only the elites, perhaps there is a value in two parties duking it out, with this line specifically being the fighting ground. And so if I can run for the common people, and if it forces the great men to actually vie for the votes of the common folks, more people will be represented if there are two groups fighting to represent the people as a whole. They'll actually have to capture not just the fringes, but perhaps a big swath of the center that is conveniently left behind. All those voters in the South and in the West who support democracy and slavery in some instances. Jackson said, who's representing their interests? The people that are not connected, do not have money, and are isolated in the agricultural sectors of the economy. As president, Jackson declared that government should offer equal protection and equal benefits to white male citizens and offer no one region or class favor. In practice, Jackson sought to empower the rising classes of the South and the West to check the power of the Eastern aristocracy. He implemented the spoils system, which has been very much outlawed since then. A spoils system of political appointments, firing anyone with loyalties to the old administration and rewarding his Western and Southern supporters with political appointments, replacing precedent with partisanship. Jackson also implemented the Presidential Nomination Convention. People forget about this. The nomination convention. He insisted that when he ran for re-election that the people actually renominate him, that he was not just the heir apparent and didn't deserve the nomination of his own. But he put the power of the presidency and the party back in the hands of the people rather than in the hands of the Congressional Caucus. Jackson, by his own efforts, used the power of the American presidency to reduce the strength of the federal government. A concentration of power in Washington, he believed, restricted opportunity to people with political connections inviting corruption. Jackson, though, was also committed to the preservation of the Union. When John C. Calhoun, his name has come up quite a few times, John C. Calhoun, an outspoken states' rights protectionist from South Carolina, when he developed the theory of nullification, it prompted a constitutional crisis that President Jackson and Martin Van Buren, Jackson's Secretary of State, rose to fight. That was the theory of nullification. Drawing from the ideas of Madison and Jefferson, John C. Calhoun argued that since the federal government was a creation of the states and comprised by the states, not the courts nor Congress, were the final arbiters of the constitutionality of what Congress did, of federal laws. If a state concluded that Congress had passed an unconstitutional law, a state, Calhoun argued, could hold a special convention and declare that federal law null and void within that state. Robert Hayne had previously used the argument against Daniel Webster in a debate over the speed at which new lands could be incorporated into the West. And the question remained generally unsettled. The argument came to a head during a Democratic Party banquet in honor of Thomas Jefferson, where Jackson and Calhoun traded toasts at this dinner. Jackson toasted, "Our federal union, it must be preserved," while Calhoun responded with his toast, "The union, next to our liberty, most dear." In 1832, the controversy over nullification produced a crisis when South Carolina called a state convention and tried to nullify two federal laws, namely the Tariff of Abominations, which critics argued punished Southern agricultural interests for the benefit of Northern manufacturers. Here's I put tariffs on here. The Tariff of Abominations is the most infamous one. Jackson insisted that nullification was treason against the United States, and he ordered a federal warship to Charleston. Violence seemed a real possibility between South Carolina and the United States government. When no state offered political allegiance with South Carolina to support the idea, Henry Clay, the newly elected South Carolina senator, was able to navigate a peaceable solution. Though proponents of nullification were able to claim a small victory, Jackson had made it clear that no state could defy the federal government alone. When I was living in Texas, there was a gubernatorial candidate for governor that ran on a platform of nullification, I think in regards to the Affordable Care Act. And so it's not a real serious idea, but the theory continues to be trotted out. Though Jackson was famously willing to use federal power against Indian tribes who resisted relocation west, he was reluctant to use federal power in other contexts, including in matters of business and economics. The Bank of the United States held a monopoly on federal deposits, providing credit to growing enterprises, issuing dependable banknotes, and serving as a dependable medium of exchange and moderation in an era of wild and irregular banking practices. As a representative of the concept of hard money interests, and as a man opposed to state-sponsored bank-issued notes entirely, he liked specie circular, he liked hard money, gold and silver. Jackson wanted to destroy the bank. The continuation of the national bank emerged as a paramount issue in the 1832 election, and Henry Clay took up the cause of the second bank on behalf of the Whig Party, seeking to renew its charter 4 years ahead of schedule. The Bank War, as it came to be known, the Bank War, failed to provide Henry Clay with a winning issue. Jackson won 55% of the popular vote in that election on his way to a second term as president. Though Jackson could not legally abolish the bank during its charter, he removed the government's deposits, firing 2 secretaries of the Treasury to do so. Cabinet shakeups were common during Jackson's tenure. See the chapter's description of the so-called Petticoat Affair. I won't mention it in the lecture. We'll go ahead and read about that. After Jackson had successfully taken all of the federal dollars out of the Second Bank of the United States, essentially neutering it for a time, Jackson moved now against the most powerful remaining institution of economic nationalism that he saw as a threat to democracy, the United States Supreme Court. After 1835, after the Federalist Chief Justice John Marshall had died, the president appointed his former Secretary of the Treasury, a man named Roger Taney, to the Supreme Court, the same man who had consented to defunding the National Bank on behalf of Jackson, and he was confirmed by the Senate. Taney's opinions and decisions echoed Jackson's own ideology, that government existed to expand the economic opportunity to the people, and it would not be possible to do this if older economic interests, government agencies like the Bank of the United States, and even American corporations were allowed to dominate the economy. Jackson's hardline tactics galvanized a growing coalition opposed to the president's use of power, especially in a second term, denouncing the president as King Andrew I, or sometimes His Excellency. They began to refer to themselves as Whigs. I previously mentioned Henry Clay. Whigs, taking the name of the party in England that traditionally worked to limit the power of the king or queen. With the emergence of the Whig Party in American politics, America had formalized its second party system that we recognize today. The Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson believed that the power of government should be limited, except to the degree that it worked to eliminate social and economic arrangements that entrenched privilege and stifled opportunity. Democrats celebrated simple farmers and honest workers and contrasted them to corrupt, monopolistic, aristocratic forces of established wealth on the East Coast. Democrats supported territorial expansion by the people, and their most radical members called for strong, even violent assaults on monopoly and privilege. The Whigs, in contrast, favored the expansion of federal power and industrial and commercial development. Whigs were cautious about westward expansion and fearful that rapid growth would produce instability. And they favored entrepreneurs and institutions that most effectively promoted economic growth. Though they tended to attract different sorts of people, both parties were more interested in winning elections than in maintaining philosophical purity, like parties today. They made adjustments to their ideology from region to region in order to attract the most votes. While Democrats were firmly unified behind Jackson, the Whigs tended to divide their allegiance among the great triumvirate of Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun. We've got Clay, Calhoun. I have not mentioned Daniel Webster. Another great American, Daniel Webster. As such, while Whigs competed well in congressional, state, and local races, they ran different candidates, different presidential candidates in different parts of the country, hoping to throw the election to the House of Representatives by running multiple candidates who would be very popular in specific regions of the country. They managed to only win 2 presidential elections in the more than 20 years of national political prominence. The Whig coalition drew strength from several earlier parties, including 2 that harnessed American political paranoia. The Anti-Masonic Party, formed in the 1820s, Anti-Masonic Party. They were formed specifically for the purpose of destroying the Freemasons. Later, an anti-immigrant sentiment formed the American Party, also called the aforementioned Know Nothing Party. The American Party sought and won offices across the country in the 1850s, but their spirit of nativism had already been an influential force in politics, particularly in the Whig Party, whose members could not fail to notice that urban Irish Catholics strongly tended to support the Democrats. Freemasonry, an international network of social clubs with arcane traditions and rituals, was and is a secular fraternal order that proclaims adherence to the ideals of the Enlightenment. In 1820s of upstate New York, it was fertile soil for new religious and social reform movements, which we'll get to in the chapters ahead. It was in that condition, or those environments, that anti-Masonic suspicion emerged for the first time as an organized political force. The trigger for this was the strange disappearance and probable murder of a man named William Morgan. I don't have him on the board, and that's okay. William Morgan. He had planned and announced that he was going to publish this book called Illustrations of Masonry that was an expose on the organization. This book purported to reveal the order's secret rites and an outrage to other local Freemasons. When a corpse washed up on the shore of Lake Ontario, Morgan's wife and friends claimed at first that it was his. The Morgan story convinced many people that Masonry was a dangerous influence in the Republic. The publicity surrounding the trials transformed local outrage in New York, upstate New York, into a political movement that, though small, had significant power in New York and in other parts of New England. This movement addressed Americans' widespread dissatisfaction about the economic and political change, giving them a handy explanation. The Republic was controlled by a secret society. That was the fear underlying the Anti-Masonic Party, and it will be a part of the Whig movement. Nativists detected many foreign threats and believed in many foreign threats, but Catholicism may have been the most important. Nativists, American nativists, watched with horror as more and more Catholic immigrants, especially from Ireland and Germany, arrived in America's cities, my ancestors. Catholics, here we are. The immigrants professed different beliefs, often spoke unfamiliar languages, and participated in alien cultural traditions. Just as importantly, nativists remembered Europe's history of warfare between Catholics and Protestants. Many Protestants saw the Catholic faith as a superstition that deprived individuals of the right to think for themselves and often enslaved them to a dictator, the Pope in Rome. They accused Catholic priests of controlling their parishioners and preying sexually on young women. They feared that Catholicism would overrun and conquer their American political system, just as their ancestors had feared it would conquer England. So it was that nativist spirit, too, that informed the Whig Party to at least a small extent. You can imagine why Jackson's supporters many of them are immigrants looking for a hand up and opportunity, and it is the poor who are supporting Jackson. Just before Martin Van Buren, himself a Democrat in the vein of Jackson, was elected president in 1836, an economic boom at the end of the Jackson era began to sweep the country. Land prices picked up, credit was plentiful, and the government had sold enough of its land holdings to have a surplus in its treasury. The first and only time this has ever occurred, not just an annual surplus, which we've had a few times, but an actual surplus of dollars in the treasury. The federal government, in response, gave the surplus back to the states, a very Jacksonian idea, who invested it in highways, roads, and canals. However, Jackson adopted a policy of only accepting gold and silver in currency for government land in the middle of this boom in an executive order called he called the Specie Circular, hard money again. No more credit, give us gold and silver. The new policy sparked a drop in confidence in banknotes that had been circulating, and Van Buren began his term just as the country headed into an unprecedented 5-year economic depression, the Panic of 1837. Though Van Buren presided over a few legislative achievements, his proposal for a new independent financial system established our current federally backed banking system. As he sought re-election, the Whigs settled on a single candidate for nomination, William Henry Harrison, a soldier of renown and a popular national figure, and faced off against Van Buren in his re-election in 1840. It was the first campaign, this 1840 campaign. Jackson's legacy is going to carry forward here. The penny press carried sensationalistic news of the candidates to large audiences, which in turn made candidates focus more on the everyman voter in American politics. Think John McCain and Barack Obama going for Joe Sixpack, quote unquote, Joe the plumber, the penny press. So newspapers are going to be significantly cheaper. And then because they've expanded the franchise so much, just poor white men as well, this idea of the common man is going to start to dominate who politicians are voting for. No longer are they appealing to these great revolutionary era values and men of valor and wealth and status. They are trying to appeal to the guy who doesn't have any money. Both parties use the same techniques of mass voter appeal. The Whigs in particular were able to paint their candidate, Harrison, a wealthy member of the frontier elite with a considerable estate, as a simple man of the people who loved living in his log cabin and drinking hard cider. The parties used music to great effect by performing the song Tippecanoe and Tyler 2. Tippecanoe and Tyler 2 at campaign rallies. The Democrats took the fall for the economic depression of 1837, and Harrison won the election handily as a Whig, though he died of pneumonia only 1 month into his term, and he was succeeded by his vice president, John Tyler. Tyler, who had been a Democrat previously before joining the Whigs, frustrated Whigs and ended up actually aligning himself with a small faction of Southern conservative Whigs who favored rejoining the Democratic Party. In the midst of these domestic controversies, international politics now took center stage. When anti-British factions in Canada launched an unsuccessful rebellion against the colonial government in 1837, an American steamship called the Caroline got caught up in the conflict and was set afire. Resentment in the United States grew rapidly. A simmering conflict over the border between Maine and British Canada flared up as a consequence, pitting Canadian and American lumberjacks against British soldiers in a brawl that became known as the Aroostook War. Later, when an American slave ship, the Creole, was seized by its captive slaves on the way to New Orleans, the British responded by declaring the slaves free men once they reached the Bahamas. Only a conciliatory British government in Great Britain salved Anglo-American relations. It looked for a time like we were heading for a third fight with Great Britain. Under Whig leadership, the United States established its first domestic relations with China in the Treaty of Wanhai. But international successes and peace were not enough for the Whigs to hold on to power, as James K. Polk, a Democrat with an explicit agenda of westward expansion in the style of Andrew Jackson, won the White House in 1844.